Alright, now that we are ready to start adding the joints, let's talk about what joints are, what we need to do with them. Okay? So to get to joints, we now need to switch from the polygon. We've been using the polygon menu here. We now need to switch to the animation menu. We also need to change from polygon tab here to the animation tab. And that's where we're going to find all of our things we're going to use. And right here we have joints. By clicking that button, you can create a joint and you can plot it, and then you hit Y and you can plot some more joints. Hit Y to do more. Okay, now an interesting thing about joints is if I plot some right here, okay, it looks like they're coming up almost up to his arm and are hooking down. But if I change my view, they're not doing that at all. It's kind of an illusion. Okay, they're going way out here in space. So whenever you are placing joints, they have to be placed on the grid. So if we want to place joints going up, we need to get to a view that has a grid going up. So you just switch to the 4 views, and now we can place joints going up. I'll select the joint tool. And now if I wanted to go up, you can see in my perspective menu or view that they have gone up off of the grid, but it's because they are laying on the front view grid. Okay, now another thing that we see here with our joint is that we have joints, which are the circles, and then bones. And the bones don't do anything. We can select our joint by selecting the bone, but they're just connections. They're just showing the connection between the joints. So this joint is the parent of all of these other joints. If I move it, all the other joints follow. This joint is the parent of all the joints below it. So if I move it, only those follow, and this first one doesn't follow. So this is what we call a hierarchy. This last one is the end joint, and it only is related to itself. It's the child of all of the children. Then we would consider this a child of this joint, but this is also a parent of this joint. So they all have a relationship going back that way. Okay? Now when we use joints, just like in the human body, our joints are for rotating. We rotate our joints. Okay? So once we have placed them and positioned them on our character, we won't be moving them around. We will be rotating them into positions. Okay? And again, if you notice the transformations over here, by pressing Control A, I've brought up this box, and we want our joints in default position to be 0 in the rotation. Now we won't be able to get 0 in the in the translation with joints, because if we zero that out, that joint jumps to the same position as its parent. Okay? So, and the reason for that is because joints, or in a parent-child relationship, the child only knows where it is in relationship to its parent. So this last joint says it's 4.5 units away, or it's from something, and it's from this joint. If I select this one and go further away from this joint, the numbers become greater. If I come in and move closer to that joint, the numbers become smaller. So we won't be able to zero out everything in our rigs in this class, but we will be able to zero out the rotation, and that will make it very handy for our rigs. Okay? The next thing to think about with joints is looking at the ways that they rotate. So one thing we need to do when we're animating or rotating joints is we need to change the way the rotate tool works. So I'm going to double click the rotate tool and it brings up its settings. Okay, in here we have rotate modes. We have a local, world, and gimbal. When animating or when using and creating joints, we need to switch it to gimbal mode. Okay, now what is happening when we do that? Okay, gimbal mode is making it so that what we see and what is happening underneath in the math and everything of the joints is what we get when we rotate. We're limited to only these 3 degrees of rotation. If I switch this back to world, the rotation gizmo has now switched and is anchored the same way as the world. So my Y is parallel to the floor, and my Z is perpendicular to the floor, and my X is also perpendicular to the floor. I can rotate them, and I get some results, but they're unpredictable. I can also click in the middle here and get it to rotate, and it just, as I move it around, it's just going in unpredictable ways. So that's okay with modeling and when moving vertices and edges and faces, but when we're moving joints, we need to know exactly where that joint came from and where it's going. So again, we need to switch to gimbal, and now when we rotate the x-axis should be turning around its axis like a forearm would as we rotate our wrist. Okay, and then the other 2 angles will rotate properly. Okay, so just remember that. Switch to gimbal when we're animating or using joints. Switch back to world or local when we are modeling. Okay? The last thing I want to mention with joints before we place them on the pig is when I plot out some joints, you see what happened there? This one popped. Let me do that again. When I plot out a joint, right now this one, the X is pointing out, straight out off of the X axis. Okay, but if I put a joint here, that joint has popped. Watch it again as I place this. It will pop into the position of its child. Okay, now that is called joint orientation. Okay, so we want our joints to be oriented to point down to the next joint. But if I were to move this joint in a certain way, which I'll explain now, okay, if I were to hold down D and move this joint, a joint is basically a pivot point, and pressing down D allows you to move a pivot point. Well, now that X-axis is not pointing down to its child. So if I wanted to rotate this, like if it was a forearm, and I wanted to rotate it down the X-axis, it's not going to work. Now I also need to switch this to gimbal and make sure that it's not working that way as well. See how it's spinning around? Okay, well there's a simple way to fix that. All I do is I select the parent, I go to skeleton, orient joint. When I did that, it changed this back now so that when I select this, I can rotate it and it spins around that axis. Okay, that's very important for our joints. Okay, now that joint orientation tool only works on joints that have a parent attribute. Like this one is a parent, but this one is not a parent. This one is a parent. Okay, so it worked on them, but on this one it did not work. So to change this one, see it's pointing down, and there's no rhyme or reason why it should be pointing down. So we need to go to the attribute editor. We can get there by also by clicking Control A. And in this list, we have underneath joint, there is joint orientation. So for just the joints at the end of a chain, we need to manually change this orientation. And I'm just going to make all of them 0. Okay, and for the hands and for the feet, that will probably be the case, and we might be picking different numbers for the head. The head is also an end joint. Okay, so we're ready to start plotting our joints on our character.